Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 17, and we're looking at warfare through time, still in the industrial era, and we're looking at the experience of war, that's recruitment, training, the impact of war on civilians. But this time, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking at the years 1850 to 1900. And as I've tried to show you before, ladies and gentlemen, 1850, a key year, because the rate of change begins to quicken. We see quite a lot of change in those 50 years. And in this video, I will show you, hopefully, what changed, and then we'll also have a discussion about why things changed. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this video: change, recruitment, training, impact of war on civilians, 1850 to 1900. So let's have a look. Now, if we're looking at change, ladies and gentlemen, there's one big new major development that we've got to look at straight away. And what is it? Well, I'll tell you what it is. Read all about it. Read all about it. Bad news in the Crimean War. Bad news in the Crimean War. Read all about it. Now, terrible impression there. But the key development in these 50 years was the change in news reporting. We're talking about newspapers, and we are talking about pictures, photographs. The Battle of Waterloo, 1815. News of the victory was brought to London by homing pigeon. Imagine that. 1815, Battle of Waterloo. The Times newspaper, probably the most famous, the most popular and respected newspaper at the time, sold about 5,000 copies per day. Go forward to 1850 and we see change, ladies and gentlemen. Now the Times is selling 40,000 copies per day. By 1850, there were other more national newspapers as well, and there was the development of trains, technologies kicking in to spread the news across the country. Equally, there was a growth and upsurge in local newspapers, over 500 local newspapers. So news reporting after 1850 became very, very important. 1854 to 1856, the Crimean War. News was reported from the battlefield using the technology at the time, these new telegraph links, and news from Crimea could be back in London within 5 hours. 5 hours compared to sending it by sea, which would have taken 20 days. Can you see there is a change here? And one of the most famous war reporters in the Crimean War was a man called William Howard Russell. And he was there and he sent many, many reports back to Britain. And the public would be able to read his reports about leadership failures, shortages of weapons, which is leading to bad news in the Crimea, and they are able to get the reports quickly. So here is one new development. Now, as well as the newspapers, there's also the photographs. Ladies and gentlemen, I know it doesn't seem it now, but there was a time when Britain used to win the Eurovision Song Contest. I know, crazy. Bucks Fizz, they won the Eurovision Song Contest, and in 1982 they had a song, and it went like this: my camera, oh, oh, my camera never lies anymore, 'cause there's nothing worth lying for. The camera. Technology improving. And a man called Roger Fenton, very famous photographer, he goes to the Crimean War. Now, he's not taking photos of the actual battlefield, but he's able to take photographs of the areas, the camps where the soldiers were staying. And he's able to show the poor quality of uniforms, tents, camps, often in bad conditions, terrible freezing weather. And these images, although they couldn't yet be produced in newspapers, the images are beginning to move and be shown around Britain. So we see that the public is becoming more aware of the reality of war. This continued through the period 1899-1902, the Boer War, where Britain was fighting over in South Africa. Again, in that war, there were over 300 news reporters, news correspondents based in South Africa. The Times alone had 20 just for one newspaper. One man wrote for the Daily Mail, which sold over 500,000 copies a day, and the Morning Post. And that man's name, you may have heard of him, Winston Churchill, was based in South Africa in the Boer War as a news correspondent. It's showing how important news and reporting the war actually became from 1850 onwards. Now, we've seen that development. What impact would it have? What changes would it have on recruitment, training, and impact of war on civilians? Well, let's have a look. Let's make a start with recruitment. Now, up to the 1850s, there have been two problems. There was a shortage in the quantity of men, and also there was a shortage in the quality of men. Check the previous video for recruitment. By the 1850s, most of the soldiers were already abroad protecting the British Empire. So when the Crimean War starts, 1854, Britain sends 25,000 soldiers, but that pretty much wiped out all of their resources, and they had to top up the number with people from the militia. Previous video. Remember, again in the previous video, something called the purchase system. I was suggesting that the officers who bought their commissions, they bought their jobs, might lead to a lack of quality. Well, this became apparent in the Crimean War. Afterwards, 1858, a royal commission was set up to investigate. Were there poor supplies, poor resources? Was there poor decision-making by the generals? So there's a royal commission set up to investigate and hopefully improve it. But not much happened. People were more concerned about the medical conditions. Maybe you've heard of a woman called Florence Nightingale, who was based out in Scutari in the Crimean War and brought that to the public's attention. I'll come back to that later. So, although there's an awareness that change needs to happen, it did not happen straight away. We needed some new factors. Now, what were they? 1868, so we've moved on about 10 years from the Royal Commission. 1868, there is a new Prime Minister, a man called Gladstone. And when he's appointed, he says, right, we need change, not only in Britain, in various parts of the public life, we need change in the army. And he appointed a man called Edward Cardwell, Lord Cardwell, as War Minister. And he said to Lord Cardwell, you've got a job. You've got to introduce some reform or some change into the army. And you may as well start with recruitment. Now, factors for change, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I've already mentioned technology. We've got the telegraph system sending the messages. We've got the cameras. That links into communications. But now we've got the government getting involved. The governments were a major factor for change. Technology, communications, government all begins to change attitudes in society, which I'll come to later in this video. So, Lord Cardwell is given the job, change, reform the army. What did he do? Well, let's have a look. Just before we get to it, another reason why Gladstone and the government were so keen now finally to change. Not only did they do quite bad in the Crimean War, there were some issues there, but they looked across to Europe and they saw the rise of a country at that time called Prussia. Later it joined in with other states and became Germany. Prussia was becoming quite a dominant force in Europe. It was winning wars, 1860 and then 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. Prussia was becoming a dominant force, and Britain thought, we need to react. We need to make our army strong to match that of Prussia. That's another reason why Cardwell finally said it's time to make reforms. So what did he do? 1870, the Army Act. He looked at enlistment. You may remember, you could join up for life, 21 years, put people off. Cardwell says, let's reduce that to 12 years. And in those 12 years, 6 years will be on active service, 6 years will be in the reserves. And even if you are in the reserves, we will pay you 4 pence a day. So he's paying for people to just be in the reserves. He's reducing the years where you'd be maybe abroad on active service. He's making it more attractive. Can you see what he's doing there? Also, in the reserves, they would offer you each year annual training or retraining. So what Cardwell is doing is he's setting up a system where you're going to get more recruits because it's more popular, and you are going to get a trained reserve. He also ended the idea of bounty money. Remember that, paying a bonus to people who brought men to join the army and then paying the men themselves, which they often drank straight away. He ended the bounty money. Next year, 1871, Cardwell brings another change, the Regularisation of the Forces Act. This time he says, right, let's split up Britain into 66 different regions, and then we'll have 66 local regiments with barracks, places to stay, so they won't have to impose on the local community. And these 66 regiments had 2 linked battalions. One would be overseas, one would serve at home, and then they could swap over. So it is reducing the time where you'd have to be abroad. That made it more attractive. Also, these 2 battalions were then linked to a third, the local militia, the 3rd battalion. He's trying to make it a more organised, more straightforward, more simple and more popular or attractive system. And you could say that he's working. More people did join or were recruited, and he's got trained soldiers at home in Britain in case of emergencies. So we can see that Cardwell's reforms are beginning to address the problem of the shortage of soldiers. Recruitment had been a problem. He's trying to make it more attractive. He also introduced other reforms. Again, 1871, he improves the rations. Is he trying to improve the way of life of the soldiers to make it more attractive? 1871, he bans and stops the idea that soldiers could be flogged. Back here in Britain, it still carried on for another 10 years or so abroad. Finally, it was banned in 1881, as was the idea of branding. So he's making the army less severe. He's making the punishments less harsh to try and attract more people. Another reform he did, remember the officers I talked about buying their job, their commission in the purchase system? 1871, that is stopped, it's abolished. So hopefully now officers will be promoted on merit and improve the quality of the officers. So Cardwell's reforms, what were the conclusions? What were the results? What were the consequences of Cardwell? Well, the army is getting more professional. He's improving recruitment, the level of recruitment. By 1900, Britain had a reserve of 80,000. That was better. So well done, Cardwell. But, as you know, there's always a but in history. There was still work to do. By 1900, the officers still pretty much came from the richer backgrounds, the middle and the upper class, because of cost. cost of uniform, cost of training, cost of accommodation. They still paid relatively low, so therefore only people from a rich background would apply. So there was still work to be done there. And in 1899, the start of the Boer War, many of the recruits, people who turned up to the army, they were physically weak. They were below par. Now that probably reflected weaknesses in society, but it shows that there was still work to do. But there were changes in recruitment. What about training? Well, remember the newspapers at the start of the video I was talking about? The newspapers had criticised the leaders in the Crimean War, most noticeably the Charge of the Light Brigade, which will appear in a video or two's time. So again, the government sets up a commission. And this time, the government commissioners visit Europe to look at what's going on over there, to look at the ideas of best practice. And they bring them back to Britain. And they say, look, we've got to train. That is important. And training was set up in 3 different ways. Number 1, training new recruits. And for that, they used the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. New recruits getting training. Number 2, existing officers. Their training needed to be improved. And again, they used the Royal Military College, but they set up a special area called the Senior Department to train existing officers. And the 3rd level of training was to train the trainers. Yeah, it's sensible. In 1853, they set up a place at Hythe, Hythe, where they trained the men who were then going to train everyone in using the rifles. 1859 at Shoebury-Ness, they trained the men who were going to train everyone to use the artillery, the gunnery. So they're training the trainers. And we see that that will be, hopefully, a good move and will increase the quality in the army. The newspapers, also in the Crimean War, had criticised the idea of supplies. There had been problems there. They realised there was a need to be more professional. So, 1855, the War Office took over and said, look, we're going to take over army transport, army supplies, army uniforms. And they set up the Army Clothing Department. It was no longer left. Remember, the colonels used to do it in the colonels' regiments. They had to provide it. But they often did it the cheapest way so that they could keep the profit. No. The government are getting involved here. So they're beginning to sort out the supplies. Remember requisitioning, where the army would take or force private businesses or private individuals to give them a wagon or horses or food. It had gone on throughout history. It didn't really work very well now in the 1800s. So again, 1855, the government say no. We need the army to be in charge of this. And they set up the Land Transport Corps. Later it was called the Military Train. And they basically were transporting everything for the army. 1888, a little bit later, another thing is set up called the Army Service Corps. And they're in charge of the provision and movement of all supplies. But they had specially trained people involved here, which again raises the quality. So training begins to improve again, 1850 to 1900. And the third and the final part of the video, the impact of war on civilians. Well, there was no actual fighting in mainland Britain, 1850 to 1900, so there were no deaths of civilians. But the impact was there in another way. Go back to the idea of newspapers, reporting. Public opinion begins to get involved, and public opinion begins to demand change. Letters are sent to newspapers, which people are reading. Remember, they're more popular. And many of the letters were critical of the government in Crimea because of the knowledge that they've got. And the government had to resign, in fact, showing the impact of public opinion. Money. The Times in 1 week asked the public for money to improve the chances of the soldiers in the Crimean War, and they raised £5,000 in 1 week. Readers giving donations. That's about £3 million in today's money, ladies and gentlemen. Now another, quite a funny example really, the Reform Club, a gentleman's club in London for very, very rich gentlemen. Well, they read in the Times newspaper of all the sort of poor conditions that the soldiers were in. So they sent their chef across to improve the quality of the cooking. Just one example of public getting involved because they've got the knowledge, because of the newspapers. Now, remember I showed you earlier attitudes in society. Well, society is beginning to change, ladies and gentlemen, all based on knowledge. Sometimes the newspapers would report victories, and that led to an upsurge in imperialism, the idea that Britain needs to spread its values, spread British values across the world, across the British Empire, imperialism. Some people took that to the next step with a word that you might not know called Jingoism. Very extreme, almost aggressive imperialism. The idea that somehow Britain is best. 1989, Tina Turner, simply the best. Yeah, better than all the rest. Apologise for the terrible singing. But this idea of Jingoism, Britain is the best, hooray, let's go and take over, hooray. Some people felt like that. It's a change in society. Other people went the other way and said, oh, look how terrible war is. I think there should be no more war. And some people, such as the Quakers and people who read the Manchester Guardian, they say, no, pacifism, being peaceful, no to war. So there was a whole range of different attitudes going on at the time. But it was a time of change. Cardwell's change, his reforms led to improvements in recruitment. Training begins to improve. Society is getting more involved. I mentioned Florence Nightingale earlier. Well, when she came back from the Crimean War, she wrote books and she made it obvious what had been happening over there. And it led to people in Britain saying, we've got to improve the quality of nursing and hospitals. And gradually there was a movement to try and improve that. People like Nightingale or another nurse that you may have heard of called Mary Seacole. So what we've done here, ladies and gentlemen, is we've looked at 1700 to 1900 and we've seen some things stayed the same, continued, and some things changed. In the next video or two, I intend to show you two key battles. We've got the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War, 1854, but before that, next video I'll start with 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. Just before we finish, what sort of question might they ask you? Well, here's a question for you. Statement. There was little change in recruitment in the period 1700 to 1900. There was little change in recruitment. How far do you agree with this statement? Well, you could use this video and the previous video. And you could say, well, actually, I don't agree with that statement very much because there was quite a bit of change in recruitment. And then you could say, right, what was actually going on 1700 to 1800, 1850? What was going on there with recruitment? Can you remember? Well, you've got the officers buying their commission, the purchase system. You've got the other ranks. You've got bounty. You've got recruiting for 21 years. You've got recruiting parties going to the pubs. You've got people going to the prisons and getting the prisoners out. You've got colonels' regiments. Can you see? That's what recruitment was like, and it wasn't very successful, and it led to a shortage. But then you could compare that to the later period, 1850 to 1900. What changes did Cardwell bring in? Well, he brought 21 years down to 12 years. He said no to the bounty system. He introduced the regulations. He said no to the colonel's regiments. He says no to the purchase system. He makes it far more professional. He makes it far more attractive. He cuts out all the horrible punishments to make it more attractive. And recruitment does begin to work, so much so that we had a reserve. So can you see how you would build an answer there? There was little change in recruitment 1700 to 1900. That is not really true, is it, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, some things stayed the same, but a lot of things did change. And hopefully these two videos will have shown you that. So, next video, we're into some... Oh, look at that. I'm all excited. Next video, we're into two of the major battles. We'll start with Waterloo, and then we'll move on to Balaclava. As ever, I hope it's been useful. Speak to you soon. Bye now.